by giving her a warm applause on this bleak and cold day. Professor.
Thanks for that introduction. The talk I'm going to give today is hopefully going to be part of a new project that I'm thinking about. It comes straight out of the book that will come out this winter. I brought a couple of flyers for those of you who are not. A Violent Embrace, in which I talk a little. I have like 2 chapters on photography, and I realized when I finished the book that I wasn't done thinking about photography. So one of the follow-up projects that I'm preparing, or kind of doing some reading on, is at this point called, it's a working title, Complex Aesthetics, Photography Surface and Depth. And I'm focusing on photography because the paradox of surface and depth that characterizes aesthetics generally acquires particular salience and a specific complexity in the context of photography. The creation and perception of photography forces the theoretical questions of meaning and being almost inevitably into the realm of a complex aesthetics. The immediacy of the perception of the pictorial surface takes precedence over the depth of meaning and context. Yet the critical distance required for aesthetic judgment would appear to have taken the upper hand in most, if not all, forms of traditional art historical paradigms. By studying a variety of photographic works, largely experimental, largely by women and queer photographers, I will explore possibilities for a complex aesthetics that keeps the paradox of surface and depth, the inherent doubleness of the image, especially of the photographic image, with its long history of ostensible indexicality and suspense. And the purpose of the project ultimately is to think through possibilities of a radically aesthetic approach to photographic images that nonetheless does not lose its explanatory power nor its political accountability. And this paper, which I wrote for a conference this summer, taking place this summer in Chicago, of the Association for at Play, what's called the Space Between Literature and Culture 1940-1945. And as you can tell, the title is Playing on the Self, Claude Cahun and the Aesthetics of Unbecoming. And the paper opens with a quote. Experience is that mass of affects, projects and memories that must perish and be born for a subject to arrive at the expression of what it is. And I put it on there because it's kind of like a complicated sentence, so you can read it. From Jean-François Lyotard's The Inhuman. French photographer and writer Claude Cahun, whose dates are 1894-1954, cuts an unruly figure in literary criticism and art history, occupying a position that has been considered marginal, but that may best be characterized as in a space in between. While considered odd, obscene, a genius nonetheless at the time she created her best-known works, in more recent years, Cahun has increasingly been associated with high modernism and surrealism, and thus been partly subsumed by the larger framework of that predominantly male avant-garde movement. Alternatively, especially as a photographer, Cahun has been playing for an affirmative feminist gender politics, often in association with artists such as Cindy Sherman and Ana Mendieta, and thus reined into an equally serious project that cannot contain the playful yet defiant aesthetic unreason that her work so singularly and occasionally quite violently enacts and obtains. Rather than argue against such, in my view, reductive approaches, what I wish to do in this paper is reflect upon the interplay of aesthetics and affect in Cahun's recalcitrant autobiography, Aveux non avenus, Disavowals or Cancelled Confessions, published in 1930. These disavowed confessions, as much as Cahun's photographic self-stagings, a proliferation of so many masked others, expose and inscribe the mobility, the proliferous and mercurial nature of a self that is never one, and never once and for all, but instead a continuously shifting configuration without any claim to legitimacy and authenticity. By exploring Cahun's playful view of this self, I want to indicate the ways in which her works do not so much represent anything, that is to say, about truth, authenticity, or identity, whether surrealist, feminist, queer, or otherwise, but rather effect an alternative mode of relating to self, to the world, to art, that defies both the parameters of scientific reason, of identity politics, and of art historical categorization, and that is essentially aesthetic in nature. Cahun, who was born Lucie Renée Mathilde Schwab, started out as a writer and poet. Today, she is best known as a photographer. In the 1920s and early 1930s, she produced a remarkable number of photographic self-portraits, only one of which was published in her lifetime. Her published writings include Heroines, published in 1925, a series of monologues based upon female fairy tale characters intertwined with witty comparisons to contemporary images of women. The already mentioned Aveux non avenue, a collection of essays and recorded dreams illustrated with photomontage, and several essays in magazines and journals. Cahun's photographs, mostly small prints that were never collected or exhibited, only came to critical attention when they were found stuffed in a couple of boxes after the death of her life partner, Suzanne Malherbe, better known as Cahun's artistic collaborator, Marcel Moore, in 1972. A multi-talented artist whose work has resisted classification in traditional critical terms, Cahun was one of the few women who actively participated in surrealism during its most vibrant years. She was referred to by André Breton as, quote, one of the most curious spirits of our time. And here you have this image. This image is it's actually owned by the DIA, but I'm very proud of that. So the one image that is pretty well known. But it has appeared in very different kind of croppings, and here you actually see that Suzanne Malherbe, her collaborator and lifelong companion, was actually part of the image originally as well. So, one of the most curious spirits of our time. Breton made this comment shortly after the publication of Aveux non avenue in 1930. His use of the adjective curious, meaning anything ranging from strange, odd, peculiar, unusual, bizarre, weird, eccentric, queer, unexpected, unfamiliar, extraordinary, abnormal, to anomalous, surprising, incongruous, and unconventional, would appear to place Cahun neatly in line with the surrealist aesthetic agenda. However, the untranslatability of the book's title, and it would actually take 77 years for an English translation to appear at all, deliberately ambiguous and indecipherable as it is, also suggests the futility of reading either the artist's verbal or her visual self-representations in exclusively hermeneutic, political, or art historical terms. Aveux can be understood as either avowals or confessions. The phrase non avenu, however, meaning invalid or void, renders the book's title opaque. Most English-speaking scholars choose to translate non avenu loosely as disavowed, which contains both avow and its negation. The play on words may thus, as one critic would have it, quote, well capture the spirit of the title, which references, with the word confessions, an entire autobiographical tradition while cancelling it out in the next breath. Quote. A critical thrust that is visually reflected in the book's cover graphic, creating out of the self-contradicting title a cancelling X, with the palindrome non reiterated at its crux. Yet, most French-speaking readers would immediately recognize the phrase in its legal resonance, where the word confessions has less to do with the inscription of a self in the form of an autobiography or memoir than with an admission of guilt or responsibility within a legal discursive system relying on truth, meaning, validity, and credibility. To them, the phrase evokes a sentence like les aveux extorqués sous la contrainte physique et mentale sont nuls et non avenus, which translates as a confession extracted from a person under physical or mental duress is null and void, and which is probably as familiar to French-speaking people as the notion statute of limitations is to speakers of American English. The phrase confessions null and void, in its immediate connection with verbs like extort, extract, wring, wrench, thus equally points out the operation of systems of representation as systems of meaning and being, and the violence of their operations in the mandatory production of a responsible, accountable, reliable, and definable self. Instead of approaching Cahun's work, both written and visual, from a representational perspective, and ask questions like, what does it mean? Who was the real Cahun behind all these masks? Why was her work forgotten in histories of surrealism until the 1980s? which can only produce rather predictable and hence not particularly interesting answers. I propose, as already indicated, to leave representational approaches aside and instead foreground or prioritize the question of aesthetics. Aesthetics, that is, not as a particular style, and not only, or perhaps not even, as the critical reflection on art and beauty, but in its more foundational sense as aesthesis, that is to say, as perception and sensation, as the fully animated yet pre-personal experience of affect. The opening sentence, or rather the non-sentence of Attitudinal Avenue, suggests such an approach. It reads, "The invisible adventure." Some critics have taken this phrase as a starting point to argue against Cahun's co-optation into and by a surrealist aesthetic. In her introduction to the English translation, Jennifer Mundy, for instance, writes that while her work, especially the collage, to some extent share the visual aesthetic of surrealism, Cahun didn't share their interest in, quote, the plumbing of the unconscious, the concept of which she seems to have doubted, unquote. Indeed, Mundy continues, and I quote again, "For her, the expression of the conscious mind, with all its contradictory impulses and equivocal emotions, was a complex enough task." She goes on to suggest that such complexity is reflected in the notes, vignettes, and longer sections of coded and disguised fantasy that make up the bulk of those cancelled confessions. True, while divided into 10 chapters, each preceded by a photomontage, the text lacks overall structure and is punctured on the micro level by a variety of paragraph markers that we would nowadays probably call special characters, symbols, or icons, stars, hearts, eyes, and mouths, which, almost like playing cards, suggest some connections, a family resemblance even, but which ultimately remain elusive. Both its structural incoherence and the illegibility of the visual aspects of the text nonetheless encourage me to reject Mundy's claims. After all, conscious thoughts, complex and contradictory as they may be, do allow for articulation, for being brought under the wing of a signifier, for being captured in the chains of signification. What ultimately remains invisible, however, are feelings. Feelings are not only by definition invisible, they are also inherently fleeting, elusive, and never-changing. Feelings pass and are never the same. We cannot feel anything twice. This, I submit, is why representation always fails to capture the invisible adventure of being, an insight that is borne out by the paragraphs following Cahun's opening gambit. And I'll read the opening gambit. The invisible adventure. The lens tracks the eyes, the mouth, the wrinkles, skin deep. The expression on the face is fierce, sometimes tragic, and then calm. A knowing calm, worked on, flashy, a professional smile, and voila. The handheld mirror reappears in the rouge and eyeshadow, a beat, full stop, new paragraph, I'll start again. In this passage, the autobiographer is first looking at herself through a lens, then in the mirror, and then through the veil of words. Neither recording device, nor reflective surface, nor words produce anything stable or consistent or true. There is no underlying truth to itself. Rather, tracking, tracing, inscribing the I produces a myriad self that is as ephemeral and as null and void as the moment it tries to capture as soon as it assumes representational form. Or perhaps better, is forced into a representational form. In this respect, there is no distinction between the conscious and the unconscious self, as we see a few lines below, and quote, "No point in making myself comfortable. The abstraction, the dream, are as limited for me as the concrete and the real. What to do? Show part of it only in a narrow mirror, as if it were the hull? Mix up a halo with spatters, refusing to bump into walls, bump into windows instead, in the black of night. Until I see everything clearly, I want to hunt myself down, struggle with myself. Who, feeling armed against her own self, do that with the vainest of words, wouldn't do her very best, if only to hit the void bang in the middle. It's false, it's very little, but it trains the eye." The focus in this passage on seeing, on vision, on perception, to some extent explains Cahun's obsessive practice of self-staging, both in a variety of roles, gender, class, and age, and in the endless range of photographs with mirrors, in the doublings, and in her self-presentations in relation to the outside world. That is to say, material objects big and small, some of which engulf in her body, others merely half covering parts of it, such as masks, in historically specific costumes, the natural garden scenes, the ocean, the beach, and the buildings. It also points to the void bang in the middle, the absence rather than the multiplicity or mere constructedness of the self. This is not a void in the sense of non-existence, however. It rather indicates that selves, our own and others, are not so much an assemblage of conscious or unconscious thoughts, but first and foremost an affective affair, the product of perception and sensation. Invisible, fleeting, never to be repeated, never the same. It is an aesthesis in perception and sensation, prior to both conscious and unconscious thought, that cells are continuously produced or perish. In approaching Cahun's work from a perspective that neither seeks to establish her position in an art historical or literary critical framework, nor one that asks questions about the political, feminist, or queer significance of her work, I'm not denying that such questions cannot or should not be meaningfully asked. I am, however, trying to connect the aesthetic effects of Cahun's sometimes quite disturbing verbal and visual self-trackings and tracings to current work in affect theory, especially to Alfred North Whitehead's theory of pure feeling. According to Whitehead, whose dates are 1861–1931, a British mathematician and philosopher of science, the basis of experience is emotional. He thereby places aesthetics rather than ontology or ethics at the center of both philosophy and being. Whitehead's theory of feeling issues an affect-laden notion of subjectivity in which aesthesis, or sensual perception, plays a constitutive role within a non-phenomenological model of becoming. Becoming in this context is not continuous, because each occasion, each act of becoming is unique, and any appearance of duration, of endurance, or continuity needs to be actively produced over and over again. Whitehead posits a notion of the self that is not so much a pre-existing entity that phenomenologically intends the world, but rather something that emerges from its encounters with the world. Each subjective, embodied, and perceptual encounter, whether with actual physical objects or with ideas or mental acts, produces the subject anew, as so many new selves as fresh events. Accordingly, neither the world nor the self is ever finalized, let alone finalizable, for the latter comes into being in the very course of its encounter with the world, which is, in its turn, in flux and multiply informed by such encounters. Since experience generally is the occasion, the moment at which the subject is born, and at which it is born anew, in its singularity over and over again, as so many fresh events in an ongoing process of discontinuous transformation, aesthetic experiences not only change in one person from that of another, as much as they change cross-culturally and historically, but they also bring forth, in a Heideggerian sense, the subject itself as a threshold occasion that will never be the same from one encounter to the next. Hence, the world is not only a messy place, but also an open space in which anything, any object, material or mental, may provide the occasion for becoming anew. Since such occasions are essentially perceptive or sensual in nature, they are prior to language, prior to thought. What I subsequently make of a certain experience, that is to say, in reflective contemplation after the event, and chaining it in discourse or representation, is an effect of critical thought, subject to the law of reason, rather than the effects of the activity of experience itself. On Whitehead's view, actual entities or occasions are thus produced and produce themselves in their actualization as discrete finite units of becoming. Rather than substances or essences, actual entities are what is given in experience, processes in their actual givenness, that are issued forth by being delimited from the total multiplicity of the universe. Objects are not given as such, but acquire limited givenness in each actual entity. And quote, the determinate definiteness of each actuality is an expression of a selection from the multiplicity of these objects or forms. End quote. But the critical point is the insistent particularity of things experienced and of the act of experiencing, an act which has no sooner happened or it is gone, to be superseded by other actual occasions of experience. Within such an aesthetics of sensation, the subject does not pre-exist, but is born anew in each fresh encounter with an object, whether physical or mental. As Whitehead succinctly puts it, quote, the word object means any entity which is a potentiality for being a component in feeling, and the word subject means the entity constituted by the process of feeling, and including this process. The feeler is the unity emergent from its own feelings. For Whitehead, there is thus neither a subject as there is for Kant, who projects the world from which the world emerges, nor is there a subject as there is for a phenomenologist, who intends the world. With Whitehead, I reject the presupposition of the existence of a consciousness that intends the identity of an object or of perception, and I follow him in recognizing the constitutive or poietic function of the aesthetic event as creative activity, as a process of becoming that critically hinges on the non-personal or pre-subjective nature of affect. Since the final unity of subjective form is, in Whitehead's words, quote, the individual immediacy of an occasion, its moment of sheer individuality, end quote, the occasion must be seen as an absolute reality, which enjoys its decisive moment, quote again, absolute self-attainment as emotional unity, only to perish into the status of an object for other occasions. This entails that every occasion is sensitive to the existence of others, that actual entities take account of or perceive one another, and therewith that the subject emerges from the total multiplicity of forms or chaos as a multi-componential process. In all of Claude Cahun's work, her photo, her collage, as much as in her confessions null and void, similar forces of de- and re-territorialization are at play. The very multiplicity of selves that she appears to project into language, onto images, onto a graspable visuality, testifies to a dynamics of dissolving identities, of becoming and unbecoming, of emergent selves that perish as soon as they are actualized in discourse or in representation. The surplus of visuality, the excessive discursive inscriptions, aveu, runs on for more than 200 pages, thus at once point to the lure of representation, to its inevitable failure in capturing identity once and for all, and to these various stagings of operation as themselves aesthetic events, the occasions for the production of precisely that which remains and must remain invisible, the absolute self-attainment as emotional unity of the self as event in a discontinuous process of transformation. Let me illustrate this messy process with a slightly longer quote from Confessions. Express oneself, humiliate oneself, yes, but for the right reason. Trample on this flesh of my flesh. Draw on remorse, weigh on my memory, on my obese statue, the only springboard that doesn't give way under me. Is that shapeless, enormous, distressing, horribly voluptuous thing lying across my path? Opportunist soul running over the body. Soul, I misuse the word. Superstition, obsession with the unknowable. What I cannot chew is precisely what I like to bite off. Love, conscience, God, selflessness. I, Jewish to the point of using my sins for my salvation, of putting my byproducts to work, of always surprising myself. My eye hooked over the edge of my own waste paper bin. Mundy characterizes Cahun's parodic view of the self as, quote, a rather poorly assembled patchwork of thoughts that had no real claim to substance or longevity. I agree. But rather than seeing this parodic view of the self as something merely borne out in terms of gender and sexuality, as some feminist art historians have claimed with regard to Cahun's highly stylized and emphatically staged androgynous self-portraits, I propose that hers is a perverse aesthetic that marks its dynamic force through the production of threshold becomings, defying the need for a ground. As so many occasions of becoming, the proliferation of masks or doubles, or mirrored selves, signifies the embrace of a dissolved self that becomes no more and no less than the expression of its many multiplying actualizations, and therewith the proliferation of equally unusual, bizarre, unexpected, and unfamiliar selves that obtain only to dissolve, to be voided or known, to recall the iota that must perish and be born for a subject to arrive at the expression of what it is. And in Cahun's own words, beneath this mask, another mask, I will never be finished lifting all these faces. The dynamic force of affect in Cahun opens up a space for the proliferation of changing assemblages, for the forging of new connections. Such affirmation need not be altogether pleasant, positive, or beautiful. Inevitably, there is a certain kind of violence at play as well, or rather a violation of the rules of certainty, of meaning, and of being. But by insisting that there is no meaning underlying any of the masks that she dons, Cahun emphatically celebrates the sites where the self remains invisible, yet irrepressibly emerges in its absolute reality as a threshold occasion at play in the spaces between.
Is there any indication as to why she never published any of the photographs during her lifetime? Because obviously photography was incredibly important to
Right.
her.
Well, especially since she made all these kind of photographic collage, right? I mean, which was very much surrealist kind of practice at the time. But no, they were just found in boxes. Some of them were only like one print copy, no negatives, nothing. Just like this is what she was doing.
Absolutely amazing.
Yeah, they were only discovered in the 80s. And a lot of people, I mean, when I say like, oh, I was working on this paper, people say, who? People are not familiar with her, even though Platon obviously recognized her as a very, important kind of female artist in the 20th century.
Renee, who took the photographs?
That's also subject to debate. A lot of them she took herself, but I think most of them were taken by Marcel Moore, her companion.
So it was almost like a private archive.
Yes.
Okay.
Which is interesting,
Yeah.
because, especially when you kind of couple that with like confessions null and void. I mean, it's kind of like production that is also at the same time a dissolution of a public self, or a kind of presentation which becomes a representation. So I think she was pretty ruthless in her artistic practice by really kind of denying a public face to. I mean, she probably would have been very successful as a visual artist if she had published these images. Since, surrealism was all
So it
the
might
rage.
have been more her process of artistic exploration and investigation.
Well, we don't know. I mean, she's dead, so we can't ask her. But what is interesting for me is that the kind of the historical circumstances in which these images were found finally really stashed away in some drawers in a couple of boxes, really helps me to think through like the radicalness of her position in relation to aesthetics, and hence also like aesthetics as a practice of everyday life.
Does the archive extend to correspondence where she might talk about the process or what she intended? I see she died at 56. I'm also curious.
Yeah, she died early. Very little of her kind of correspondence has been like made public or has been made available to the public, even in a kind of archival form. Marcel Moore was like, she was in charge of everything. And she survived her for almost 20 years. So it's hard to tell what happened with the archive.
Was Marcel an artist
Yes.
on the scene as well at the
Yes.
time?
Yeah, there's nowadays, there are a couple of really interesting books that also show all the images that actually has Marcel as its subject. Much less well known, also because she's not nearly as striking a figure as Cahun. Those images, I mean, this is one of my favorite images, but it's also really spooky. It's like also like really scary. But you see, what I kind of like also is that she kind of repeats she dons certain costumes, and then 30 years later she does the same. So there's kind of the kind of instability and the kind of constantly, like the kind of dynamics of becoming and unbecoming is very much inscribed on the visual level by having like exactly the same costumes. In different historical moments when her body has aged, when her face has changed quite dramatically.
I thought the garden photos were particularly interesting because some of them, were including these kind of work she was doing herself in her photographs, and some of them look like, a snap when she was out walking in the garden.
Yeah, those must have been taken by Marcel, but I love the ones where she has her cat with her, when she walks her cat in the garden. It's like,
Striking.
yes.
I'm just kind of wondering about how this is technically accomplished, an image like this, like a double exposure.
It's not
she
quite-
publishes the shadow, it's
Yes.
so realistic. It's amazing.
I think that kind of like the technical aspects were very much part of Marcel Moore's like participation, contribution to this project.
I have another biographical question. It's kind of hard on first encounter,
Yeah,
not to think
Yeah.
about biography, but did she and her partner make their living through art, or
No, they
what was
actually.
that kind of
They
keeping body
had
and
like,
soul
you know,
together
independent
context?
kind of like incomes. Marcel was pretty wealthy, came from a well-off family. They moved to this island, and of course now I'm blanking on the island's name, off of the coast of Brittany during the war. And they actually kind of almost died during the war. They were almost kind of executed by the Germans because they started like posting like protest like messages on the island, and then they were arrested and thrown into jail, and they were in jail, and they were actually sentenced to death. But they somehow miraculously kind of like escaped that fate. But they spent like 3 or 4 months in a German prison during the occupation. And that is one of the reasons, or that is speculation, of course, that Claude Cahun's kind of health was severely compromised by that period. But they were, it's kind of funny, there's a documentary film where all these people are being kind of like, oh, what do you think of these weird, you know, people that live on your island? Because they walked around in all these weird kind of like outfits, right? And they went to the beach and were naked, and they were 2 women, and they didn't look like 2 women. And all these islanders were like, oh, yeah, they were kind of weird, but they were kind of cool too. It's like, it's really interesting how like a small community totally like accepts that there are kind of these kind of crazy looking, and they did weird things, like, you know, setting up all these kind of stagings on the beach, like being naked, and like they were fine with that. Like, it's very interesting. So they were kind of like protected.
That's interesting.
As well. So I think they somehow made it's like a long detour, but I think they somehow made their living also by being, because they were on that small island. You know, it was relatively easy for them to trade things, and they obviously have a kitchen garden as well, vegetable garden, so who knows.
Yeah, I was particularly struck by the wandering between genders. And I was wondering if, it's just amazing to go back and forth, basically.
Right.
In her writings, does she talk much about gender?
No, she doesn't really talk about gender, but this is like really my interest in it. She kind of really kind of avoids and annuls those categories in what she does, which is a much more radical stance than saying, oh yes, gender is a construction, and see, I can construct it in multiple ways. I think she really shows, both in the writing and in the self-stagings, that not only are, you know, gender identities constructions and multiple, but really they don't mean anything. They really do not carry any meaning beyond the moment of performance. And if you perform them differently, then that will be the meaning of the animate, like, you know, the animate body. I find that is like really what I find like really interesting about what she's doing.
Yeah, particularly because, I mean, that's why I was wondering if there was any cross between what's going on in science, because in genetics at the same time, they're just beginning to explore the fact that you can be born, you know, that males and females are not, you know, eternal categories.
Right.
There's a lot of crossover between with organisms and stuff.
Right.
It's just kind of interesting.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, this is what I will be, when I work on this, like, and turn it into a chapter, hopefully eventually, I will actually kind of focus more on, like, what are the connections that the body, the presented body is forging with what, you know, we would call props, but actually kind of constitute what that body can present itself as, only to perish and become something else again. Because we know, like, photographs are moments, right? It's not an ongoing narrative. That's why the photographic medium, I think, is so crucial to what is happening in these photographs. But to talk, to kind of like, just kind of come back to your question, does she talk about gender? She does take on Jewishness. Look in one of the quotes that is a part of the paper. She claims her Jewish identity in a way that she never claimed her gender identity, and that must have had to do with like the historical circumstances in which she lived and worked.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Is there a biography?
Yeah, there's like, I mean, art historians write, but they write such crap. No. It's like so superficial. But there are works. I can bring you some books. I mean, I have like basically everything that's been published about her. But you should go and see this image, the original at the DIA. It's pretty amazing when you see it for the first time. This is, especially because there are so many different kind of like versions out there. It's not big. It's only this size, and you would think, oh my God, you know, nowadays we're so used to art photography, like Codex is like huge, like you know, almost like paintings, like traditional paintings. These are very modest kind of, I think, explorations rather than anything else, which makes them, for me, much more interesting than once they become established as something that we can define
Even at
and
the time.
categorize. Yeah, yeah.
I mean, then and now, right?
Right,
Yep.
yeah.
Does her art put you in the mind of Frida Kahlo?
I always have this, this is why I'm not an art historian, because I always have a hard time. I mean, that's why I mentioned, like, Cindy Sherman has been, like, often associated with her Mendieta, and, like, the moment you start kind of drawing an analogy, I think all analogies are faulty, and you never really end up with something that is productive. But, yes, I mean, in the sense that they were both, you know, pretty radical artists. But Frida Kahlo had a very powerful public persona. And Cahun basically not. She chose not to be in the limelight. So that makes her investment in what is this work actually doing much more elusive than like, look, I'm presenting this to the world, look what I can do, right? Which is what, you know, artists and scholars.
Maybe it was because you're more valuable after you die, don't they say that?
But that's kind of like weird because you can't project yourself beyond life, right? I mean, that's where everything stops because you don't feel anything anymore, so there's no way that you can project yourself dead.
Yeah.
So I find that a hard way to do. But that's also because I'm not religious, so.
Maybe it just worked out for
Yeah.
the best.
Thank you.
Renee, could you talk just a little bit about the circus pictures? You know, the barbells and
Oh.
The strong woman pictures.
Wanna go there? So this one, hang on.
That's a great picture.
Why we're not moving? Look, becoming animal in the Deleuzian sense.
Yeah?
Trying to move this. See, lots of pictures where the animal actually is very much part of the presentation of the self. I'm trying to go back, but it's kind of hard because the time.
So much comfort there.
It disappeared. I lost it. Okay. This is the one you mean, right?
Well, there's a whole series of
Yeah.
them, right? And I just wondered,
I'm trying to get this back. Okay.
wasn't there I mean, I don't know very much about the history of photography, but I know that the circus was
Well, the most famous one in this series is the one, Don't Kiss Me. Where is it? What is it? Really odd, I think. You see that? Like, I'm training, don't kiss me, so there's like this play upon this whole idea that men, you know, cannot have sex or they kind of like passionately involved in anything before they have to put up a random and they fight. So there's this kind of like play, but it's never really in your face. But yeah, obviously this is very much also part of European cabaret in the 1920s. That kind of outfits very much remind me of what I've seen from especially like cabarets in Berlin. So she picks up on all these, but there's always like another layer, because when you look at the balls, you know, there's like what's written on it, like, and then there's an image in there. So there's you never kind of end by looking at the surface only because there's always a new surface that kind of is in your face. This is why I like it's very annoying work in that respect, and that's why I'm interested in it.
There's text on her chest too.
Yeah, that's like I'm training, don't kiss me.
Oh, okay.
So the kind of
But
jokes about
it does remind me of early photography of circuses and freak shows and that whole.
But then this, I find this an amazing image.
Not a circus image,
No. And they're all these are all around the same time. Because you can tell that she's more or less the same age.
She was young when she took them.
Well, when women dress up like men, they usually look like boys. Younger. In the words like this.
I'm trying to think about time and continuity, even though that's, I mean, that's sort of not what you've been talking about. So I'm just wondering, because there are so many images, and you said earlier that she also reused the same costumes later in life.
Where's the one in the...
To what, you know, are you thinking about this at all, or is there something to be said about continuity and discontinuity?
Yes. Well, when I follow Whitehead in the idea that, you know, the self is processual, but that doesn't mean that it's just multiple or complex, but that the process is actually an ongoing process of discontinuous transformation. So that I could probably answer your question because it's both. The process never stops because the moment it stops, we are no longer, right? That's the moment when we die.
Right.
That's the moment of death, like ultimate unbecoming dissolution of self. But according to Whitehead, like every kind of encounter, whether it's with a table or an interesting thought or an image, produces in that particular moment, in that very moment. And that self only exists for that moment that it's being actualized, and then it perishes. And then whatever that experience has been for you, I mean, not like, you know, it's not a particularly interesting experience to touch and take, but like an image, for instance, like your engagement with art or a novel or with a person or an idea, becomes that perished self that is no longer, because it only exists in the moment of its production and is carried only by the feelings that sustain it, becomes a memory or an experience that you can reflect upon, and hence one among many of different occasions that actually also influence and talk to, like, by lack of a better term, like talk to the experience that follow. So it's both ongoing and discontinuous, this kind of idea of the self.
Hence your quote at the beginning.
Hence my quote, yes. And a quote is actually, it's a difficult concept because we can't really think that very much because our language or in our conceptual universe doesn't really allow us to think of a self that has to perish in order to be expressed, to kind of, I can go back to it if you like. And of course, it's not a coincidence that Lyotard writes this in The Inhuman, where he really does what nowadays we would call the post-human. It's how kind of like, you know, studies in post-humanism today are not about like queer or animal studies, but really about trying to get away from a humanist conceptual framework per se. And when you think about it, like experience is really all we have. I'm totally convinced of this.
Right.
And of course, it's difficult for us to kind of embrace that because it makes the self really kind of like totally elusive, the invisible. invisible adventure, right? Because we can never really see that self, because we can only see ourselves in terms of representation. It's very difficult to see expression, or to define expression, or to find words for expression, or to actually capture expression in signification. Because the moment we do it, it's no longer the expression. It becomes a discourse about the expression.
I wondered also to what extent we have access to that experience.
It's a difficult one, yes, because the moment you start consciously thinking about it, you're already kind of like at one remove from the experience. At the same time, we do feel things intensely. So that's our access point.
Right.
It doesn't mean that we don't, like the fact that we can't capture our experiences fully, comprehensively, or ultimately satisfactorily in language or in signification or in representation doesn't mean that we don't have these experiences. And that's why this is my whole project, to try to find words, like what I call neo-aesthetics, to try to find words that actually kind of meaningfully talk about this without immediately kind of falling back like, oh, we already know this. So hence like two follow-up projects too, because I'm not done yet with this at all. But really the fact that you can capture experiences in language doesn't mean that you don't have experiences. It's a very simple kind of logic. The same way that you kind of like, you know, the fact that it's difficult for us to kind of like actually kind of talk about aesthetics in a certain way, because the moment we start talking about it, it's no longer, you know, the aesthetic experience, perception, and sensation, doesn't mean that there was no point in talking, that there was no point in asking aesthetic questions, rather than permanently or semiotic ones.
You know, in a very, I'll say, odd connection that quote means more after you're talking than it does before, and what you were just saying about inexperience and language and things like that reminds me of Liliana Krogovatz's project, where she is looking at the evolution of syntax and looking at the you know, kind of predication as the kind of operation of language. And so she has to think, I think, about, you know, pre-linguistic.
Yes. I mean,
Or
feeling is...
even when you're just getting started with it, even parallel, you know, times when there was language and was not language. And so that might be interesting.
It's difficult for us to grasp because
Yeah.
we think of time in terms of like sequentiality and
Right.
kind of,
But
and that you can't really
you
do
can't
that.
think about evolution in
No.
that way. But she
No.
has to think about some of these same ideas. It might be interesting for you guys to have a conversation.
I would love to have a conversation with her about that. But I was also thinking about like really, there's this guy at the Rackham parking structure. He always uses, whenever I don't know the park at, but he always says like, how are you feeling today? And that's such a real question to me. Not like what are you thinking about or what have you been doing, but really, what is it that you are being at this particular moment in time, which will be over the moment you reach your car, right? It's like, but there is something in our natural language that actually already indicates that feeling is prior to thinking. And Whitehead calls like conscious thought like high-grade kind of operations of an organism. 95% of our bodies do things like unconsciously, like 5%. I mean, that's like not a lot.
No.
Like just like you sitting in your chair, I mean, kind of, and totally unconscious. Best example, of course, is like driving a car. You don't think about what you're doing; you just do it. Your body has learned how to do it. You can call it muscle memory, but you can also say, no, this is an affective kind of process that is pre-verbal, really, and that also allows us to connect with like a world out there in its mobility, in its dynamism, which makes, you know, our connection. For instance, our connection to a car. This is what I started thinking about many years ago when I started doing new body theory. And I thought, how is it that when people, also reflected in like when people say, where are you parked? Like I'm not parked anywhere, like my car is parked somewhere. But that car and me are so much like, there's a kind of converged unit.
It's a canvas.
And it's weird, right? I mean, when you kind of like hurt your car, it's almost like you hurt the way, as if you hurt yourself. When you bump up against something, like, oh no, you know, you feel it in your gut. That's an interesting thing, that we can make that effective connection to something, or just basically, you know, a big piece of like crap. Expensive, but still. But we have an emotional response to, especially when it goes wrong, right? When we kind of like break our car.
We express ourselves to a certain extent through these objects.
But that's already on a level that you think, oh look, I'm driving a Lexus, which I will never do. But really, when your car gets hurt, or when your hard drive crashes,
Or your home is invaded.
yes, that's a violation, which you feel in your gut, which is not just like, oh, okay, I need to get some extra locks on the door, or kind of like an alarm system. That's like all later. But the way you're upset, the way you're affected by events like that, really are animate and not necessarily, you know, the high-grade experience that we consider like our key, or the key to ourselves, which is conscious thought. I'm fascinated with this, but anyway, thank you all for coming and for your and thank you, Walter, for allowing me to do this after